only verdict is vengeance. Vendetta.
So first and foremost, I rewatched the film the other night for the first time in I think maybe about 10 years, and I watched
Mm,
it with my wife who watched it for the first time,
mm.
and she did not know what to expect, and I didn't tell her anything about it. And the first thing she said when we finished was, "Why does that feel like real life?" And I said, "What do you mean real life?" And she said, "Well, take away, the guy in the mask with the swords and everything, the news stuff. It feels so real." And I was like, do you think that when you made it in 2006, you thought that those themes would be so timely and relevant 20 years later?
It's always hard to, estimate what the life of a film is, like how the public will accept it. I think what I did know was that the graphic novel that it was adapted from was written during the Thatcherite period
Hmm.
in the UK. And those same thoughts and fears, I guess, were expressed in the graphic novel. And so they were still relevant when we went to make the film. And so it was like an adaptation of that and just bring it into a more, you know, modern existence, I guess. But, like, fear used to justify stronger state power, detention or exclusion of, groups as threats, controversies around surveillance and transparency, struggle over control of political narratives, right? Conflict with the press, crisis to further executive authority. I think they're all probably things we're dealing with at the moment, and I guess I'm saying that because I feel the politic of the film is circular and cyclical, right? Like those things that people in the UK felt, during Thatcher were the same things that we were feeling during the Bush administration, and same things a lot of people are feeling at the moment. So I think it goes in waves. It comes in waves. You have like this, like a period we're in at the moment, a period we're in around the Bush administration, and during so depending on what country you're in,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah.
I know it's an interesting point. I think it is funny how politics and the way that life goes, it does seem to be peaks and troughs in terms of edging towards kind of like a proto-fascism, and then it veers rapidly away from it. Like, I can't believe we're doing this, and then it creeps back down to it again. Um, so when you look back at the film, is there anything that surprises you in particular about how the audiences that watched it have continued to use it and sort of interpret it to their own, you know, just however they see it?
I think it's kind of like the strength of the film, to tell you the truth, right? Like you really hope that when audiences watch a film, that they'll get the meaning behind the film, which often doesn't happen, but people really embraced V for Vendetta and the narrative themes that it was talking about, right? Like, and the characters, I think, there's a lot to be said for the plethora of characters in there that people, latch on to, right? Because, Evie, was played by Natalie Portman, I think she was really a really good access point to the radical ideas that, V had. And
Hmm.
I think that when you're having a discussion, obviously or potentially about the morality of terrorism, right, which is, what you sort of discuss, what you're discussing with V for Vendetta in some ways, like, a personal vendetta with the view to changing society at large, right? And it's that whole, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, all right?
Yeah.
But I think like audiences really understood what the film was trying to do. And then I think the double whammy was the mask, right? The mask lived on. The mask, and people really understood what the mask represented, right? Which was there was more power in a group of people, and the mask let people protest in a way they couldn't have before. And so I think like the film resonated that way. It sort of spread its tentacles out into society, and so now you know, just about everyone in the world knows what a Guy Fawkes mask is, right? It's like
Exactly.
yeah, it's like it's an amazing thing for your film to slip into the culture like that. You know, like it's just, well, a one in a million shot sometimes.
And you were talking about how obviously you have that interpretation of if he is a terrorist, if he is a freedom fighter, and how we're asked to interpret him.
Mm,
Obviously, the viewers in the film they have to give their emotional investment into him, because he's charismatic and he's poetic and he's fun. But obviously, he's extremely violent. He's extremely dangerous. He's a
mm,
killer.
mm.
How do you, as the director, how do you navigate the line between sort of like mythologizing him and like preserving that idea of this is still a really bad guy?
The film at its core is about the tension between authority and the individual liberty.
Mhm.
And I think that you can't preach to the audience, right? You have to, you know, present it almost like facts, right? Like, here's what this guy does. Here's the other side of what is happening because this guy is doing it, right? You present that his vendetta is shaped because of the things that happened to him.
Yep.
And does that justify what he does after that? And I think for the most part, people go, no, he's a he's a murderous villain, but he has this greater overarching idea of how society and government could be, right?
Mhm.
So you either like accept what he's trying to do, right, which is this sort of, you know, way of anarchy to get what he wants, or what the film gives you at the end is maybe it's better than having a personal vendetta. It's better to try and do it through the will of the people, which is, you know, ultimately what the political system is set up for. And I
Yep.
think that's what you know, you try and do. And I feel like the film also is, you know, even though it was a graphic novel adaptation, we approached its themes very, you know, seriously. You know, we wanted it to be like a discussion on what political regimes do, and I think people embrace that.
Yeah, well, that was one of the questions I had was, when you were shaping the film, what was like one of the most essential aspects to preserve from the graphic novel itself? Was it the political philosophy of it, or was it, the emotional arc, or just like the unease, generally the story generated?
I think it's all of those things you said, actually, right? I think what you're ultimately trying to do when you do any adaptation of a book is capture the essence and the authenticity of, you know, what the book is about.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, the great thing about, you know, what Alan Moore did with David Lloyd is they weave together the politic, right? They weaved in philosophy. They weaved in all of these disparate elements that go to make up this graphic novel, which was, you know, like quite different at the time, right? It was like, you know, it was literally groundbreaking. So all the discussions that they were trying to have, you know, about the state, about, you know, political anarchy, you know, the tone, trying to make it a political thriller, you know, leaning into the atmosphere and the architecture, right, of the
Yep.
alternate near future of Britain, right? All those things we tried to bring in to the film.
On the actual filmmaking side of or just sort of the on-camera side of things,
Mm,
obviously the casting is one of the really strong points of the film.
mm.
Um, what made Natalie Portman the right choice for Evie for you?
You know, I had a relationship with Natalie, you know, like in my, you know, former life as an assistant director. I did a Star Wars film, so I knew Natalie from that. But and from speaking with her, Um, she's obviously a great actress, but she really had a grasp of the material, right? She really loved the material. Like, she's super bright, really well read. Um, so she seemed like a really great choice for the film. You know, the other actors, you know, like Stephen Rea, you know, Stephen Fry, John Hurt. Um, all those actors came from my love of UK cinema. Like, growing up in Australia, you got like this great cultural hybrid of American cinema, UK cinema. And so all those actors were on my radar. And when I had a chance to, cast anyone I would like, I guess, at the time, yeah, I went for those guys. All extraordinary actors, all with great careers in the UK film industry. And yeah, it was a joy to cast that movie, actually. I did it with Lucinda Sison, who I still work with today. And I think a lot of those actors really were surprised that we were going to actually get the film made. They're like, "Wow, is Warner Brothers really going to make this movie?" And we're like, "Yeah, look, they're into it," because it was a great piece of writing. I think the Wachowskis adaptation, if you just looked at it as a screenplay, you could see the ambition. You could see how the intimacy was balanced with the spectacle. And I really felt like they just looked at it and went, okay, this could be a really good film. It slipped, under the wire politically, which was kind of good at the time. And also we were coming off the back of the Matrix movie, so I think they were inclined to let us go off and make something.
Um, do you think that the reason why the film, like you said, slipped under the radar, do you think it was because it was set in London, with a primarily British cast, and just the idea of, it's the British state media, it talks about America, but off in the distance. Do you think that's maybe why it didn't set off the alarm bells as much? Because I don't think it would work as well if it was, say, a New York film set. I think it would end up being something more akin to like The Running Man, if that was the case.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that's an astute point, right? I mean, I think you're right. It was seen as an adaptation of a graphic novel about a place that wasn't America, right? You're right in that. And I think that really Warner Brothers were game to make it because, probably quite frankly, they saw there would be money in it, right? I mean, that's usually what you get to make.
Of course,
You get to make a film, right? But it sort of harkened back to political thrillers of the '70s, right? Which Warner Brothers had like a great run of doing, and I think at the time the studio head Alan Horn and Jeff Robinoff, they had great success at the time with a lot of different films, and they were game to make it. And Joel Silver really helped the producer. He really helped shepherd it through the studio system at the time. So yeah, kudos to them actually for making the film. Yeah.
And back on the subject of the cast, obviously, we've got Hugo in the lead role under the mask, but Hugo came onto the film after it started, as I recall.
Yeah.
Um, what is the process like, especially if you're directing two different people? But I'm assuming that scenes that were shot prior to his arrival were still used because of the mask aspect of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
How much of a challenge is it technically as a director to direct an actor who's under a mask and get a performance out of them? And was there a difference in the style of doing that between the two actors?
Yeah, there's a few other people underneath the mask too, actually. Like there's Dave Leitch, who has great success, Bullet Train and
Oh, really? I did not know that.
Hobbs and Shaw, right? He's under the mask there. At one point, he was like he and Chad Stahelski, who's the John Wick guy, John Wick director, I should say. They were the stunt coordinators on that movie. And so, Dave was under the mask for a bit of it. In answer to your question, it depends on how much you embrace, being under the mask, right? And Hugo, who was a friend who I knew from the Matrix, who I knew from the Australian film industry, when he came onto the film, he was like, "This is the greatest thing ever," right? Like he was like, "This is amazing." He'd done, mask work at theater when he was at drama school. Sorry, he'd also done some Noe theater. Has that tradition in it. And he came on. Yes, he came on late. But the first scene I ever did with him was when Evie gets released from the Potemkin prison. You know, like she's had her awakening and she comes out and she realizes that she's been in the shadow gallery the whole time. And that was the first scene that Hugo did. And when he acted that scene, I'm like, oh my God, this guy just saved me. He loved being in it. He had all the gesticulation that I needed. He had the voice that I needed, even though you couldn't mic the mask, so I had to do the performance all over again in looping or ADR. But he was amazing. He was amazing in it. And you know, like James Purefoy, who was the other guy in that. Yeah, he was more troubled by the mask. And so, you know, he's a great, he's a great actor. But you know, also you're taking away someone's tool that they've been using, their face, right, that they've been using for 40 years. And so, you know, that's hard to do. But you know, Hugo was into it.
Well, just speaking quick, I'll just throw one in about Under the Mask. Which is there any particular action scene where I could spot David Leitch as V? Any action scenes at all that you can recall?
Yeah, the in the alleyway where Evie first meets the finger man, right? That's Dave, you know, doing like the stunty stuff there. Also in the underground tube station at the end where V throws all the knives.
Mhm.
That's Dave. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to do a rewatch tonight and be like, ah, now I know. Now I know the secrets, the trade
Yeah,
secrets.
yeah. Those guys, yeah, like Chad and Dave were the stunt coordinators on that. And then the next movie I did was Ninja Assassin, and they were the second unit directors on that. And that was the first time they'd done both of those things. So I'm glad they've gone on to a very successful careers, those two.
Absolutely. One of the things I love about the film is the way it stages its destruction beautifully. So, you know, with the operatic music, the
Mm.
1812 overture, it is, you know, the Houses of Parliament getting destroyed is just one of the most sort of stunning scenes I can recall.
Mm.
Um, it's like, was that necessary for you to do as well in order to show us through these eyes that what he's doing is for a better world, essentially, because he's making these destructions look as beautiful as they are?
I think that it's more of a cinematic flourish than it is like a V. I mean, I think, you know, like if the question is, does V know what it's going to look like? I think maybe not, right? Like ultimately, you know, those explosions that blow out like the Houses of Parliament and they blow out Big Ben, right? That's meant to be the train that goes
Yeah.
underneath the Houses of Parliament, right? You know, I think that there's a discussion about the, you know, in the film about whether buildings have meaning, right?
Mhm.
And you know, V goes on to say, you know, like no, really, it's the people who, you know, give the meaning to buildings. But you can, he believes that you can destroy these great symbols of power and authority, and it can mean something.
Yep.
And if people are witness to that destruction, you know, maybe they get the underlying thought in there that, you know, why are these buildings being, you know, destroyed?
Yep. Um, so V's entire strategy itself is theatrical, you know, the costume and the language and the music and all that sort of stuff.
Mm.
Is his performance the part of his own resistance as well? Is that people performing as their form of resistance, you know, the theatricality like Dietrich as well, with his satire show ending up getting him killed? Is
Mhm.
it showing that performance and not sort of complying is the most dangerous way you can approach fascism?
I think there's like a beauty in a disguise, right? There's a beauty in performativity, right? Which is, I think, is what V gets into. I think he embraces, you know, the ethos of the original Guy Fawkes,
Mhm.
and I think he's tailored himself as a representation of Guy Fawkes. And so, yeah, I think in answer to your question there, yeah, yes, there is some, dramatist to be had in presenting yourself in a costume, right? And in Dietrich's way, right? Like it's a, it's a parody. He has this sort of, I guess his costume is parody, and V's costume, is deadly in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing about V's theatricality that I had to ask was, is there an official note anywhere about how long he spent building those dominoes
Is
before he
there
knocked them down?
is there what did you say?
An official note of how long we think it took him to set that up before he knocked it down. It must have taken forever.
Oh, it did. It took I remember it was some Belgian guys that came in and did it. We, scoured around, and it took them a couple of days. And then,
Oh,
yeah, then we had this very kind of nervous moment, right, where you set up the cameras, and, one is a dolly shot. And then it literally, if you tip it, actually, that's a funny story about Dave. Actually, he was the guy behind the mask who had to flick the domino, right? I'd never seen him sweat so much in his life, right? He was just like, because one bad flick, and it would have, So anyway, they set it up. We got all the cameras ready. Dave was sitting there on the floor. He flicked the domino, and off it went. Yeah, it went amazing though. Those guys were incredible. And then I think in the end, just for the final dominoes coming together, there's a tighter shot. We filmed that as a separate setup, actually.
uh, I wanted to go back quickly to the casting aspect and having John Hurt in the film because
Mm,
obviously um, that has a sort of meta layer for people who are, more aware
yeah.
of dystopia in general.
Yeah.
Um, was that something like when you cast him, or when he was cast in the film rather, was that something you were aiming for? It was like we should try and get John Hurt for this, or did it just fall into place? It's like this could not be more perfect if we tried.
No, yeah, I actively went after John Hurt, right? I was aware of Winston in 1984,
Mhm.
and uh, and yeah, but he's a phenomenal actor with
Mm.
like a phenomenal career, and he embraced it, right? Like as you can see, um, I tried to make Sutler, his character as outlandish as possible, right? Uh, but even now, right? If I wrote how politic is now, the performative part of politic now, right? Like, and you put that in a script back then, people would go, "That's ridiculous. No one would ever do that, or say that, or be that, or whatever." Um, but at the time, I was trying to make him, part of that long lineage of these cartoonish characters
Yeah,
that change countries, right? Like if you watch speeches by Adolf Hitler, right? You just go, wow, how did a whole nation of people follow
exactly.
this guy, right? Like some of those rallies, Mussolini, right? Like there's a long history of these, cartoonish characters that come to power that people follow. And so I tried to give that a bit of that to Sutler, but he's nowhere near where we are at the moment. He is like
Um,
he's like a tame baby compared to where we are at the moment.
and obviously now you've got 20 years of hindsight,
Mm,
and without rewriting history, and you can take the 20 years that have followed into account. Is there
mm.
anything that you would have filmed differently with the knowledge of the future? Would you have changed anything at all about the film?
I don't think so. I feel like you make the best film that you can at any given time, and I feel like uh, V has become timeless because it didn't try to lean too much into the politic of the day, right? It tried to give you this overview of political systems and people that exist in it, and individual freedoms that always exist within those political systems, but wrapped up, in an anti-superhero movie, right? And I don't think I would have changed anything, just because the parallels are there, and they'll be there in 40 years and they'll be there in 60 years. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I don't know, would I change Sutler a bit? Probably. I might turn the volume up to 11 on that instead of 10 like I did.
And my last question for you, obviously we are discussing the 20 years since the film came out.
Yeah.
That means that the film has endured. Why do you think it's endured? Do you think it's because of anything specific it predicted, or do you think it's just because, the film and the story itself, it understood that recurring pattern of fear and the media manipulation, and then the public's desire to just follow whatever's put in front of them, and then the cycle goes on and on?
I think it is what you said at the start. I think you said it was the first time your wife had watched the movie, right? And I think whenever you pick that movie up, no matter whether it's the government systems that we're in at the moment, you can look around and you can see the parallels to what's going on in your life at any given time, right? Or if it isn't, then it's in the very recent past.
Yeah.
And I think people responded to that. I think so. People get it at this, primal level. And I think that the mask really helped cement it in people's imagination, right? I really felt when it went wide culturally, right? Like whether it was during the Arab Spring or the Wall Street protests or
Yep.
the Scientology protests or the protests in Asia, the people understood. People understood the power of the mask, and people understood that the film was there as an allegory about where we could end up. And I think that's still relevant now.
Well, that's great, James. Thank you so much. This was an honor for me and a privilege, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, yeah, you too, man. Thanks for taking the time, Chris. It was nice to talk to you. Thanks for all the good questions, by the way.